So thank you for joining us today. We have David Archer here, who's the head of central bank studies at the BIS. And David and I have been engaged in discussing this issue, should central banks publish the policy rate path for a few weeks now. And it's been interesting. I think we started off with a little debate, and then I think we've converged, but I think you'll get to see whether or not we've converged completely, and we both will jump into the discussion, possibly to clarify points. And we would also encourage people in the audience to also jump in if they have questions about clarification. But the plan is that we'll spend 60 minutes as usual discussing the topic, and then we'll leave 30 minutes after that. David, did you have a few words to say before we begin?
No, just very happy to be here. It's a fun topic.
Okay, so I guess we'll give you our bottom line. And our bottom line is, yes, central banks should publish the path of the policy rate, but they should also publish more scenarios in their monetary policy reports to better educate people about the role of monetary policy, even during normal times, but especially when times are very uncertain and there are asymmetric risks. And then at the end, using the Czech National Bank as an example, and as David just pointed out before we began, we're choosing the Czech National Bank because they're right at the frontiers of transparency and monetary policy making. And so when we offer suggestions to them to improve, we're talking, about a club that is at the best of the best, okay? So we're gonna offer some very practical suggestions about how to structure the monetary policy report to include more analysis of scenarios and to de-emphasize when there is excessive focus on the most likely scenario. Okay, so that's going to be our bottom line that we're going to try and convince you of. Now, this, from my perspective, started off with the publication of a book before I left the International Monetary Fund called Advancing the Frontiers of Monetary Policy Making. And this book took stock of all of the technical assistance that we did, really starting with New Zealand. In fact, that's where David and I met right at the very beginning of this long journey. But this book was meant to take stock of what are best practices. Now, I want to emphasize that these best practices are still evolving, but this book, which is published in 2018, was meant to take stock of those things. Now, obviously, we've had COVID, but research has continued to develop in this area. We've had the US adopt this dual mandate and price level path targeting, average inflation targeting framework. And so things are developing quickly. And so this thing does not stand still. Now, the COVID-19 related shocks has sort of underscored the importance of what we described as the prudent risk management monetary policy strategy. It's also underscored the importance of policy coordination, not only between monetary and macroprudential policies, which have to be coordinated, but also between fiscal policy. And the way I think I'd like to stress what is coordination between monetary and fiscal. Well, it can start with cooperation, stressing the limits of monetary policy for dealing with issues related to COVID-19. So this is I think a really good example of country cases where this has worked well. So what is inflation forecast targeting? So another name for this is flexible inflation targeting, and we mean the same thing by these terms. Under inflation forecast targeting, the central bank's inflation forecast represents this ideal intermediate target, okay? And it's used to communicate how the central bank is managing the short-run output and inflation trade-off. This could be an explicit dual mandate central bank, like the Fed and now like the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Or it could be an implicit dual mandate central bank where they don't have full employment written specifically into central bank law, but in practice, the central bank could be employing a dual mandate simply because if they didn't do that, it would result in massive instability in the real economy if they tried to target inflation on a period by period basis. Now, this inflation forecast is also ideal in the sense that it should be based on all available information and views about the how the economy works. Well, one might say, David in particular, yikes. This sounds a lot like engineering or finding the most likely path of the policy rate. And so that's why when we've communicated this stuff in the past, when we've been developing these frameworks inside central banks, that we've also emphasized that best practice central banks also place important emphasis on uncertainty or avoiding dark corners, or what we call the prudent risk management approach to policy formulation and communications. Okay, and so this is the way to think about monetary policy during any regime, and so we don't want people to have this kind of engineering notion of what we're talking about here. Now, an example of this was something that we did years ago in 2015 when we were providing recommendations to the Fed. And here we're simply just looking at the potential benefits of a strategy that involves a planned overshoot in the inflation target. And so the idea is that the economy starts off with some economic slack. In the example that's on the right-hand side, the economic slack is about -2%, so it's purely illustrative. And we compare basically what a standard kind of reaction function Taylor type of rule, how it would choose the path of the policy rate to gradually bring inflation back to a 2% target, versus a loss function approach where you're directly minimizing the square deviations of output gaps and inflation. And in that particular case, you're going to be much, much more aggressive at keeping the policy interest rate low for longer so that you can actually generate a path for inflation that overshoots a little bit. That gets the real interest rate down. And then, of course, gets you away from the dark corner where there's economic slack and the possibility that further shocks could come along that could push you into a low inflation trap. Okay, so that's the idea. So when we use this idea of optimal policy, we're using it very much as a line drawing machine as opposed to a technical exercise where we get some model, assume that it's true, and then do optimal policy. That's not really what we're doing right here. We're thinking about this loss function as simply just a good way to draw a line for the path of the policy rate that's going to be better than a reaction function that has, for example, time invariant weights on the output gap and inflation. Now, this policy obviously is being pursued by the Fed right now. And so there's numerous speeches that have come out since they've adopted this dual mandate average inflation targeting framework that has this planned overshooting characteristic. And so this is one of the speeches recently by John Williams, which describes the policy. One of the chief architects of the policy is Clarida, and again, he's describing the policy. So there's repeated speeches. This is one by Lal Brainerd, who's really emphasizing the importance of the dual mandate and full employment and how they want to steer the economy away from a potential dark corner where there's maybe hysteretic effects in the labor market, and how the risks are asymmetric in the sense that the cost of getting stuck in a low inflation trap with high unemployment, they view as being larger than the potential costs of overshooting. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that they have lots of policy space on the upside to deal with the potential overshooting in inflation. Now, these frameworks that we're going to talk about, these flexible inflation targeting frameworks and inflation forecast targeting frameworks, they are the most transparent central banks in the world. And this is true both from Ginser and Eichengreen's measure of transparency that ranks most of them almost perfect. And it's also true of a new transparency index that we've created that's been designed specifically for evaluating these very highly transparent central banks. And so these central banks have very forward-looking frameworks that start off with an analytical framework that we're going to characterize in a very stylized fashion here, where we start off with the interest rate path. So if we thought about that in the days before inflation targeting, we would normally think about the central bank as setting the policy interest rate today and not talking about the future very much. It would say as little as possible and let action speak. The new view about monetary policy is all about being very transparent about how to think about monetary policy. And then, of course, giving markets some idea about the implications of what's going on in the economy for the future path of the policy rate. And of course, it's that future path of the policy rate that influences the longer term interest rates that are relevant for household and firm decisions. For many open economies, of course, the exchange rate is a very important part of the transmission channel, so that expected path of the interest rate through the expectation theory, through the risk-adjusted UIP condition, is influenced by that expected path of the interest rate as well. And then, of course, those are the direct effects of monetary policy on financial markets, then risk premium change, which are totally ignored in the picture. And that influences aggregate demand, the output gap, and underlying inflationary pressures. And now we're starting to get to what are the objectives of monetary policy? What are the basic objectives? And this all happens in a world where there are all different kinds of shocks affecting the economy. So how do we think of a good forecast in this environment? And one way to think about that is to divide it into different ingredients. And so the very first ingredient is, where is the economy starting off? So what is the output gap? Where is underlying inflation? And so on. And then, of course, the second question is, what are the underlying driving forces? So today, it would be all about the battle between the vaccine and the virus. So what are those underlying forces? We have to make assumptions for those things. And then after we've done that, we then ask, what do we need to do with our policy instruments? And this could be both monetary and fiscal to achieve our basic policy objectives. And of course, we could then ask, well, what if we didn't adjust these policy instruments sufficiently aggressively? What would be the implications in terms of achieving or not achieving our objectives? So on transparency, we can think of a natural order. So central banks usually start off with announcing a numerical long-term inflation objective. So in the case of the Fed, this didn't happen until January of 2012. But that then sets in motion, a lot of central banks, this process where they build a forecasting and policy analysis system that allows them to be clearer about policy trade-offs. And they do this by providing forecasts to explain to the public and financial market participants about how they would be managing things like the output inflation trade-off. And by output inflation trade-off, we really mean full employment. And so again, we're using this as a simple characterization of how we would think about those basic policy objectives in the real world. And then, of course, publishing a monetary policy report, press conferences, minutes if you have a monetary policy committee. And then, of course, now we're getting down to the issue that is the topic of the presentation, publishing the endogenous policy interest rate path that is consistent with the dual mandate managing these trade-offs. And then, of course, it needs to be fleshed out totally by publishing a complete macro forecast and description of the central bank's forecasting and policy analysis system. So David and I met in the very early stages of inflation targeting in New Zealand. So I think we'll get him to take you through what happened in New Zealand and how they should to do this.
Yeah, so looking at the pictures on the screen now, you can see that the period is divided essentially into two parts, where the first is a territory where there had already been an announcement of an inflation objective, an inflation target. This was the first announcement of inflation targeting, or an inflation target in the world. So there was already the anchoring or the discipline mechanism for the policymakers had been established. But we suffered from not having the machinery available to process some of the questions that Doug has been talking about. The types of questions involved in thinking about the policy trade-offs. What were the implications in terms of the output variance if we responded in an aggressive way or a less aggressive way? And going back to the pictures that Doug was showing before in terms of thinking about whether you might want to accelerate the policy adjustment or hold the policy adjustment for longer, or follow a very conventional step-by-step consistent adjustment path, such as you would get out of a standard policy reaction function. These kind of questions were simply too difficult to process in the head, in the mind, or in spreadsheets or whatever. So the creation of the forecasting model, the forecasting and policy analysis model, was critical to the transition from the first stage of the New Zealand experience to the second stage of the New Zealand experience. So there are two things going on here in the transition. The first is one has the capability to do the analysis necessary to think about alternative policy strategies when you have such a machine. The second, which is actually quite important, I think, to the fact that we started publishing an endogenous policy path right from the beginning of the second stage. Unlike the natural sequence that Doug took you through before, where the publication of an endogenous policy path was kind of down the list, for us it was up the list right at the beginning, and for the following reason. Having developed the machinery to be able to allow us to evaluate the consequences of going fast or going slow with a policy adjustment, We were then producing forecasts where policy was endogenous within the forecast. Then had to confront the question, well, having developed a forecast with endogenous policy, what do you tell the public? Would you go out with a forecast which is articulated but not say what was happening to policy? Well, that would be dishonest. Would you go out with an assumption of a no policy change assumption, which was the experience up to then? Well, that would be dishonest. And it simply makes a huge difference when you're saying we're adjusting the policy rate, say 25 basis points today, but we also expect to have to keep on adjusting the policy rate by 25 basis points each meeting for the next year, compared with simply saying we're adjusting the policy rate 25 basis points today and not telling you anything about the future. The needs to cope with this or deal with this question of, do you produce an honest forecast, an honest discussion of the forecast, or essentially hide what's going on with policy in the forecast, was something we've confronted right at the beginning and made the decision that we needed to publish a forward path in order to be honest, in order to be complete in that discussion. And essentially, I don't think there have been any regrets about that decision since we took that decision.
Okay, good. So the first question to you, David, you used the word machinery, okay, which gives the impression that it's, you know, you just have to go away and create the model and the programs and so on. I like to think about it as human capital. And usually it takes central banks, in my experience, about 3 years to actually not only develop the machine, but actually learn how to drive the machine and so on.
No, I think this is absolutely right on the mark. The machinery I have in mind is the combination between the people and the technology they use to process questions. People can't do the stuff on their heads. You can't do a sort of a dynamic solution to something which has got embedded expectations in it in your head. You have to use some technology, but you can't. The technology has to be used smartly. You need to learn how to ask questions within the context of a forecasting system.
I see this as like a real problem nowadays, because we've actually created this wonderful marriage between academia and central banks, but I see central banks just sort of taking those models and sort of treating them as what does the model say, whereas when you're actually using this stuff at the level of policy analysis, it's thinking more fundamentally about economics, and it's not just one model, it's thinking about the economics and using models as a way to strive for macroeconomic consistency, okay? But anyway, at the Czech National Bank, Thomas had this wonderful video a couple of weeks ago where he explained it takes 50 people to do everything. And so if you're interested in learning more about how it's done at the Czech National Bank, I have a feeling it takes less people at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, David, or do you have a good idea of what?
I'm not sure where they are now because I've been away from that place for now nearly 15 years, but certainly when we started down this track, there was only a dozen people involved in the process. We've got an answer from Rebecca Williams, 15 people. So a dozen, 15 people, it's still about the same order of magnitude. The question, if you think of it in terms of how do you process the really interesting questions of what are your policy options, given the kind of shocks you think you're facing? What are the implications of assuming this or that about the shape of the Phillips curve or its equivalent within the model? There are not too many people you need, but you need expert people to be able to process these kind of questions with the aid of a model. If you then want to flesh everything out in terms of, okay, what are the implications of that for this or that subsector of the economy, which is not modeled, but you want to do an off-model kind of linkage, this takes a lot more questions, a lot more people rather. So the size of the team that's involved in the forecasting and the production of a forecast may be rather larger than the size of the team managing the big questions at the core of the process.
Okay, so New Zealand, they don't have a forecasting and policy analysis system. They developed one and they jumped straight to what we call full-fledged inflation forecast targeting by publishing the path of the policy rate right away. Other central banks have taken a more transitional approach. And so the Czech Republic, which Thomas talked about a couple of weeks ago, so I would suggest that you go back and look at his videos if you really want to understand things. But the short story is that they get thrown off a pegged exchange rate like many countries in the late 1990s. And so they get thrown into this world of flexible exchange rates. And we characterize that as inflation targeting light, because as was the case in New Zealand, they don't really have the analytical framework to support forward-looking policies. So they invest in it. And after about 3 years, out comes the forecasting and policy analysis system, which was documented in a book, aptly called the Czech book in 2003. And then they start doing inflation forecast targeting, but only using words to describe the path of the policy rate. Now, the policymakers become so comfortable with that over time, monetary policy becomes more transparent. And then by 2008, the board decides that it's time to publish the path of the policy rate. So we can see that developing this FPAS provides the foundation for increases in monetary policy transparency over time. And this basic story, we're going through the countries one by one. We've just completed Chile and the United States. This kind of story sort of applies just about everywhere. It's only a question of how fast these central banks are increasing their transparency. So again, Czech National Bank, they go to inflation forecast targeting without publishing the path of the policy rate initially. The policymakers get comfortable with it, and then by 2008, they decide to publish. This is just some answers to some survey questions that we did to monetary policy experts. And I think I want you to ask yourself after we're finished with the presentations whether or not you buy these answers. But why is central bank transparency so important? And so our experts said that obviously to improve the effectiveness of monetary policy, because monetary policy works by influencing longer term interest rates and prices like the exchange rate. And so to the extent that monetary policy can provide better information about what the central bank is going to do in the future, then that should improve the efficiency of monetary policy. So there seemed to be pretty strong agreement of that. The second thing that there was really strong agreement on was that it's a requirement of democratic principles and accountability. So if you give the central bank independence, the only way that you're going to hold them accountable in this world of inflation forecast targeting is if there's incredibly high levels of monetary policy transparency. And then the third reason is that it helps to build support actually for central bank independence and the policies. And interestingly enough, some respondents indicated that it actually simplifies monetary policy communications to do it this way. It actually becomes as simple probably as it can be compared to the case when you don't have this forecasting and policy analysis system. And it provides the possibility, so it doesn't guarantee increases in economic literacy and the population at large, but at least provides the possibility for hope that there would be increases in transparency over time. Now, to go back to the questions, or this very specific question that we posed in the title of this talk, should the central bank publish the path of the policy rate? We have a response by Lars Svensson about his views about that. So we're not just going to choose Lars, we're going to choose a few people that have views about this specific question. Lars' views are pretty stark. He said that you don't publish the path of the policy rate. You have an incomplete decision-making process. And this is very much related to David's point earlier that if you don't publish the path of the policy rate, it's like you're hiding the most important piece of information, because it's trying to tell you what you need to do during normal times with your instrument path to achieve your basic output and inflation objectives. Now, there's not a consensus here. So, for example, Rick Mishkin has a paper, and not just in one paper, but he's been recommending this to many central banks, that it's actually going too far to publish the path of the policy rate. And in fact, he refers to a paper by Goodhart that argues that a great advantage of restricting the choice of what to do now this month is that it makes the decision relatively simple, even stark. And then he has this argument: if a policy projection with time varying rates is announced, this clearly requires that the Monetary Policy Committee come to an agreement on this policy path. And I don't think that's true. That's not what's done in central banks like Czech National Bank and so on. So the policymakers do not necessarily have to come to an agreement about that path. In fact, I think it would be incredibly difficult to actually have a regime where they did have to come to an agreement on that path, because the job of the policymakers is, during that last meeting before they make a decision, is to discuss things and have a very active debate about those things, and then to immediately announce what it is that they've decided. So the idea that they could do all that in a day is simply impossible. Now, of course, they could try to do that over a period of weeks, but then the big issue would be that what if something happens, the day before or a couple of days before? Are they really going to be able to provide a consistent forecast? So at central banks like the Czech National Bank and other central banks, the staff produce a forecast, they impose the consistency, and that forecast is used as a frame of reference to allow the policymakers to have this incredibly rich discussion and to explain their views relative to what that staff baseline forecast is. And now another person that's been very critical of publishing the path of the policy rate has been Steve Polas. And he, I think, has some very legitimate concerns. And it's important for us to note that Steve was referring to the experiences with what we describe as unconventional forward guidance. So this is where you're really telling financial markets that you're going to keep the interest rate low for some long period of time. So this was used by the big central banks during the global financial crisis. Okay, and that also needs to be contrasted with what we describe as conventional forward guidance, which is just publishing your path of the policy rate along with a bunch of assumptions about what has gone into the scenario for that path for the policy rate. So we need to distinguish between that unconventional forward guidance that was used by the big central banks during the global financial crisis versus the conventional forward guidance that the Czech National Bank has been using simply through the publication of a forecast. And so anyway, the thing that Steve is concerned about is that if the central bank starts doing this, that financial markets will just be focusing on what the central bank is forecasting, and they'll stop doing their job of actually assessing the state of the economy, of creating their own forecasts. And as a result of that, they'll become too dependent on the central bank, and the central bank will lose the information that it gets from financial markets, the signaling information about what financial market participants that are taking positions in financial markets are thinking about what that future path of the policy rate is and how it's related to longer term interest rates and asset prices.
And for those who want to get into the theory of this stuff, you can look up some early work by Hyun-Sung Shin and Stephen Morris, who kind of did the modeling of this problem quite some time ago, and there's some updated work that they've done in the last few years as well. So Morris and Shin is the reference.
Okay, so the parts that I think Steve is absolutely correct on, and what are the risks of unconventional forward guidance. And so this goes back to the idea that, you know, central banks were trying to provide lots of stimulation to their economies. They were trying to get long-term interest rates down. And long-term interest rates are partly a function of the expected path of the policy rate, but they're also a function of term premium, which are supposed to be a compensation for interest rate risk. And so if central banks say we're going to keep interest rates low for long, and if people really believe that, and they're taking all the uncertainty that financial markets would typically price into the term premium, and the central bank is kind of taking on that uncertainty. And the problem with that is that while it might be very successful in getting long-term interest rates down, if that is successful in stimulating the economy, there's going to come a day when you have to exit the policy. And when you exit the policy, there can be these discontinuous jumps in the term premium and long-term interest rates. And we saw this during the taper tantrum, okay, when there was statements by the Fed, Bernanke in particular, and those statements were interpreted by financial markets that there was going to be a change in monetary policy, and as a result, you had this large increase in the term premium. We're sort of seeing that a little bit today, in the sense that term premium is increasing. The other criticism that Steve Polis had was that once you get into this forward guidance game, markets become addicted to it, and so you have to keep supplying the forward guidance. And the problem is that the type of forward guidance changes over time. And so this is an example of the United States, where we look at how they started off with qualitative, and then they moved to date-based, and then they moved to threshold-based. And so this doesn't look like the type of conventional forward guidance that we're actually recommending, and so on. So, but Steve also doesn't like conventional forward guidance or publishing the path of the policy rate, and he has very legitimate concerns that basically financial markets might fall asleep if this is not managed appropriately. And so the question that we're going to be asking is, can these concerns be overcome with scenarios, communication, and education? So one thing is obviously stressing uncertainty. And again, our analytical framework, the purpose of this analytical framework is not to tell us what the answer is in terms of this path of the policy rate. It's also can be used heavily to assess the uncertainty about how we think about shocks hitting the economy, uncertainty about these various linkages and so on. And so that's important. Or another way of putting it is that central bank staff don't have crystal balls. And so maybe David can take over at this point.
Yeah, so let me now reflect a little bit before I go into the next slide on the kind of concerns that have been raised by Michigan and Pollitt and many, many others. At the base of them, at the heart of these concerns, I think is, I'm going to put it more bluntly than they would put it, that it's just a dumb idea to talk about the future when you don't know anything about the future. You really cannot predict the future. So why would you go out there with a statement which is about forward guidance, which relies on knowledge of the future? Why would you do the all times version of that, the conventional forward guidance by publishing a policy path into the future when you don't really know much about the future? This is the underlying concern, and this part of the concern is absolutely right. The critics are channeling their understanding that we have very, very poor knowledge of the future. So looking at the next part, we have at the next slide, we have an example here from the ECB of staff macro forecasts, where you have these trace paths of what they predicted for core inflation at various points in time. Now, clearly, their forecasts were consistently secularly wrong. If you look at the next slide, you're going to see the same, I call these hedgehog charts, but this is one from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. I compiled some time ago, and that's why it's out of date. Same picture. The trace paths of the prediction for the policy rate, the thing which we recommend that central banks provide, are consistently wrong. They're very, very poor predictors of what's actually going to happen. A recent, relatively recent examination of Bank of England forecasting did it in more careful way of looking at the ability of the Bank of England to forecast. And if you want to get into these numbers, what they're telling you is that for the inflation rate, which is the key variable of interest, within the policy relevant horizon, the ratio of the forecast error from the bank to the forecast error from something as dumb as a random walk is 1. Put it in another language, the Bank of England adds no information to a simple random walk, despite all of the effort they put into the forecasting. So we can't forecast. This is the essential conclusion. It's actually even worse than that. If you look at the next slide, when we really want to be able to adjust policy appropriately, it's when big, nasty things happen. When you have a recession. This is from analysis from a while back in terms of how capable our forecasters in predicting recessions. Well, it turns out that it's not until the year of the recession itself that forecasters start allowing for the fact that there's going to be a recession in that year. Now, recall that we are talking about forward-looking policy where we want to anticipate what's going on, and it turns out that we're not at all good at that. Let me just read something very quickly from Alan Greenspan back in 2004 in the address to the American Economic Association, where he started talking about policy as risk management. 2004, before the great financial crisis, before COVID, He said the Federal Reserve's experiences over the past 2 decades make it clear that uncertainty is not just a pervasive feature of the monetary policy landscape, it is the defining characteristic of that landscape. So I think what we've got from this evidence and from the assessments we get from people like Greenspan is that we have to take uncertainty seriously and think about what we're doing with our forward-looking policy. The conclusion I draw is that when we are doing forward-looking policy, when we are presenting policy paths into the future, we are not forecasting. We are analyzing the situation that we're confronting and asking questions about what is a smart policy response in such circumstances. It would be even better if we took that lesson seriously about how to think about forward-looking policy and drop the idea of having single baseline projections and instead replace a single baseline projection with 2 or more scenarios where we explore the consequences of moving policy faster or slower, or the consequences of assuming that the Phillips curve is in the process of steepening and the apparent flatness is a mirage for some reason, or some of the other critical questions that we confront. So, Doug, if you want to come back into the Czech examples here in the next slide.
And we have Thomas here, so obviously you can jump in if you want. So I'll give you a bird's eye view of this stuff. So how does the Czech National Bank do this? So this is an example from the August 2008 forecast. Now you may remember in mid-September we had the Lehman event. So this is actually a forecast before the Lehman event. And they had this scenario where the global economy was slowing down. And so you see the growth rate is slowing down from fairly high rates. But what was also interesting, to remember before the global financial crisis in the summer of 2008, we had oil prices peaking at about $150 a barrel. So you had those shocks affecting year-on-year calculations of the CPI. But in the Czech Republic, they also had some other temporary factors that were affecting the CPI that the staff thought were going to fall out of the year-on-year calculations, that they just needed to be patient. So there were these temporary factors that were going to fall out, and the underlying driving forces for the Czech economy, given its openness, given this projected slowdown in the global economy, was for, and this is really important, was for there to be a tendency for the policy rate to decline over time. So they put confidence bands around this projection of the policy rate, and they aren't kidding when they put these confidence bands around them, because they want people to understand that this forecast is all about, is there a tendency for rates to either rise or fall over time? And again, in this particular forecast, it was for a decline in rates. Now, you might ask yourself, is this more complicated than other ways of doing it? The process of doing it this way is that you have a staff that puts together a consistent forecast, that presents it to the board. And then, of course, the board have their own views. They use that forecast as a frame of reference. It was locked in usually a week or two before the board actually meets and makes the final decision. So things can happen in that interval when the forecast is locked in versus when the policy decision takes place. And you simply just then describe policy as what are the policymakers doing, reacting to this forecast, describing how their assumptions would differ than this baseline forecast. So that's pretty well as simple as it gets. Because if you don't have that, then you will obviously have to replace it with something else. And so what does that something else look like? So first thing is that the Czech National Bank looked at that forecast and they decided, yes, we are confident that those temporary factors will fall out of the year-on-year calculation of their price index. And in addition to that, we're confident that the global economy is going to slow down, and given the openness of the Czech economy, it's going to slow down as well. So yes, we agree with the basic thrust of that forecast, and so they cut the policy rate. Now, central banks that did not have this framework, this forward-looking framework where you think in terms of instruments and objectives, they were dealing with a very difficult situation because they were also facing these inflationary pressures. Everybody was facing the $150 price of oil in the summer of 2008. And so what they did is they raised rates. So this is the case of the ECB raising rates and using words to defend their policy actions. Now, this is interesting because the specific quote that we associate here with this increase was this statement: the fact that we have not mentioned heightened alertness or strong vigilance. So strong vigilance was used earlier, doesn't mean anything. And so the problem with using words where you're not just describing a forecast about what's necessary is those words can start to take on meanings that maybe were not intended. So a good example, I think, is strong vigilance. After you use that word strong vigilance, what do you use next? You just go back to plain vanilla vigilance. But this is not the only example. There are examples from the Fed, for example, where they use the word patient in terms of their strategy for raising interest rates. So they were going to be patient raising interest rates. Well, then you drop that word patient, and they said, well, just because we're dropping the word patient doesn't mean we're going to be impatient. So I asked you, what is simpler? Just to produce this forecast for the policymakers to explain their views relative to this forecast and simply to document what that is? Or is it better, to use these words to describe and summarize policy actions? Now, the Czech National Bank wasn't special in the sense that they also ran into the effect of lower bound on interest rates during the European debt crisis, again, because they're very connected, very open, very connected to Germany and the rest of Europe and so on. And so their forecast in November of 2013 actually had them not only at the effect of lower bound, but what the Czechs did is they actually allowed the interest rate to fall below the effect of lower bound, just as an illustrative device to show that even in those circumstances, they were concerned with how slowly inflation was going to be expected to return back to their 2% target. But more importantly, that when you looked at the distributions for inflation and output, you had what we describe as bad deflationary risks. So when prices are falling and the economy is booming, that's good. But when prices are falling and when there's potential for debt deflation and for the economy to contract, that is really serious. That's an incredibly serious problem for central banks and monetary policy around the world. because of concerns about that, when they looked at this scenario, they needed to think in terms of another instrument to basically fill the policy space that was lost by hitting the effective lower bound. And in the case of the Czech National Bank, given the openness, the obvious strategy was to use the exchange rate, okay? Using this FX intervention strategy, which they referred to as the FX commitment. Now, what did it mean? So
Doug, I'm just wondering if given in the interest of time, we just maybe skip past the exchange rate part of the question and go to thinking about, so is the projection with an uncertainty band doing enough to treat the uncertainty problem? And we're describing many of the, giving it nice case studies of how uncertainty can arrive in its various dimensions. Perhaps if we go skip to the second to last slide of the slide deck, and then back to the question of how you might revise the policy presentation in the Czech National Bank's case as a case study.
Okay, so the answer is, David, yes. Let's do that. But the answer is no, if they just presented the confidence bands by themselves, okay, without saying we need to have this other policy action.
Right.
Okay? So clearly these charts would not be sufficient, but the fact that they developed this alternative framework to deal with what they viewed as being a real problem. Okay.
So what you're going to see now in some graphs coming up is some material that the Fed staff put together to inform the discussion of the FOMC back in 2012, where you can see a number of scenarios which they presented to the Feds, to the FOMC, which were cogent questions, real issues that the Fed was facing at the time back in 2012. So this is in the question of what's the nature of the recovery from the GFC going to look like? When is stimulus going to ignite the fire, or is it not going to ignite the fire at all? Is Summers correct that this is going to continue to sort of run along the bottom for a long period of time? We're already seeing the possibility that the developing crisis in Europe could spill over globally and cause massive problems. So the point to take from these graphs is that there are several alternative outlooks for the economy which you could trace out if you have a forecasting model to be able to use, which they do, and see the consequences for policy and the consequences for your target variables. Now, the process of choosing a policy path in such circumstances is thinking about the nature of the policy risks you're confronting, the asymmetries that Doug referred to earlier, the consequences of finding yourself in a situation where, for example, you've got no policy space on one side, but lots of policy space on the other side. These are questions of the risk assessment about how to make a choice which best balances all of these asymmetries and potentially awkward outcomes. This is a very complicated picture, and you would not want to present such a complicated picture to the public. But generally speaking, you're going to be in a situation of having at least a couple of alternative paths that are in the minds of the policymakers. And this is what they're processing in the course of their policy discussions around the Open Market Committee table or the Monetary Policy Committee table. Presenting the two most interesting for the moment scenarios to the public and using that as a way of discussing different policy reactions, different policy responses which may be needed and the choice that you're currently making to best manage these risks is a recommendation that we would have for the Czech National Bank. So to go back to looking at the Czech National Bank's current way of doing things, they have some great stuff in the way they present their policy to the public. Very tight, very succinct summary of the policy issues being confronted and the choices being made, which is totally what we recommend to continue. But it brings the policy risk analysis more to the fore of the discussion, illustrate the balancing of considerations that's going on within the board by reference to at least two scenarios which are of most relevance to that discussion. And then using like a new section of the document to amplify the reasoning. Over time, as you build up experience with scenarios, you've confronted several scenarios which are relevant. You can build up an annex, an appendix to the document, potentially an online example of it, where you have different scenarios which have been processed in the course of policy discussions, which can be referred to also during the discussion and allow the public to be able to see how policy would respond in such circumstances when they arise again in the future. So this is the essence of, I mean, I think probably push a little further down this track than Doug does. I would almost make the recommendation that the word forecast should be dropped from the lexicon in the course of discussing forward-looking policy with the public and with financial markets. We ought to stop, in my view, characterizing these as forecasts. Even the word projection, which is softer than a forecast, still carries with it the sorts of fears which we see reflected in the Pollock's and Mishkin and other criticisms of presenting forward paths, but instead focus in on the kind of scenario analysis that the policymakers are doing when they're thinking about what is a good choice for policy now.